as we go. Thank you.
One of the fragmentation in our society, we are no longer sitting around a television as a family experiencing and taking in the same media. So as we have this greater exposure to this hyper-personalization of the media that we consume, I would be interested to know, what is your reflection looking forward on perhaps how we as a society might change the way that we remember and commemorate as we bring our own much more diverse experiences of these things to the act of remembering?
Going in order.
It's a great question. I'm going to focus on social media in responding, and that's obviously only part of the media landscape. Social media is both such an extraordinary challenge and such an extraordinary opportunity. The ability of people from all over to participate meaningfully together, the breaking of hierarchies. Twitter, before it was enshittified, was a brilliant thing. So certainly in terms of Indian history, there were lots of people in India who were in dialogue with people in the global north. There were people who were doing family history research, who were in a common space. So the best of that, I think, can be emancipatory, and you can truffle out stories that don't get told normally in that way. And so that is amazing. And yet what we have now is so degraded from that in so many ways, and then fuels other forms of media. The Daily Mail and the Telegraph, but a whole range. If you read the comments under a Financial Times article, it's just horrifying. How can we re-seize the opportunity from the horrific challenge? I don't have an answer for that, but the opportunity bit of it and the optimist bit of me makes me think, there must be pathways that we can forge through that landscape. Matt.
It is a good question. I tend to agree with the perspective Margot gives, because I do think that you're right, it is fragmented, but it's also not homogenous because of that. And within that landscape, there are some very interesting examples of people using the media in very different ways. I think especially where we get in a situation where you have these sort of more established media spaces in such a tight competition now, just to be able to still get eyeballs and purchases, just to keep the lights on. There is a sort of distancing with I've noticed certain critical groups that want to forge their own ways of representing the past, which is a business we all do here. But as well as reporting on the present. And I think that can be very exciting. We have podcasts, for instance, in multiple different sorts of linguistic formations, including in the Caribbean, where I'm from, there are increasingly more Creole language podcasts and news sources and YouTube channels that people are using to access. And also people are seeing the benefit of that for telling stories of the past, not just the sort of stories we commemorate in these events, but things that are often not highlighted. And I think that's encouraging. But the challenge, of course, remains. It's going to be increasingly more crowded as time goes on, and it's going to be people sticking their shoulders out to get their voices heard. But in it, there is some possibility.
Thank you, Matt. Benedict.
Oh, thank you. This is a really good question. What I guess I give a different answer. I work very closely with people who use the media and who find it very useful. For example, the activists are constantly communicating internationally through media and organizing campaigns. And I try to support them with the kind of historical analysis. But a lot of my work is actually, there's only 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and so much of it is just basic academic research with about 50 to 60 researchers around the world, many in Africa, with students who's never heard about the history of Africa, and who, as the moment you start talking about the title of an African ruler, don't know what you're talking about. And it's an entire continent, and the sources are little used and little translated. So before I worry about the media, I am trying to make these sources accessible, to analyze them, to have conversations with colleagues who perhaps use the media. I don't manage, I don't find the time.
Thank you. David.
Just a question for Benedetta. When you say perspectival, do you mean from the point of view of the people you're studying? Is that you use the phrase perspectival?
It's my sort of clumsy translation of regard croisé, that it's more it's quite common in French historiography, and it's the idea of understanding, of looking at a particular event and then looking at using sources to understand what are the political and intellectual projects of the authors of these sources. So what are the perspectives of the enslaved, the slave owners, the traders, the British abolitionists, when they are all experiencing the same event on African soil, on the coast, on a ship? What is at stake for them? And that, to me, is the essential historical question. And I don't want to reduce it to one, I don't want to have one dominant perspective, but I want to keep the understanding that there's always multiple ways to understand the same historical events and identities. So that's what I mean by perspectivalism. Thank you.
Oh, Claude.
How do you think society's got so good at forgetting things on an almost industrial level, where we have these big events and we're so good at just pushing them to one side? How did we get to that?
Well, I'll start. First thing I'd say is that we need to think about which societies in particular you might have in mind. And then even within one society, there are many different subgroups of that society. I think the issue really is about that question that Antonio started us off with, about how do we remember and how do we forget, right? And part of the idea of remembering collectively is often involves forgetting of something. And that's the big question. And one of the things that I'm always fascinated with is really sort of what's that process like within a particular nation state? When it is, for instance, a state that was formed out of colonialism, and you choose not to remember what you had remembered before, and you choose to create new remembrances. But what's lost in that transference? Because what was remembered before had value to that particular society at a particular time. And I think it's very important that we appreciate that when we look at that past. We can't just sort of say that that's irrelevant. And I think that that's part of the answer, really thinking about the process of remembering and forgetting within a society and how it functions and changes over time, to get to a sense of, why it responds, or why there's an expectation of a response at a moment of celebration or commemoration.
Yeah, I'm just going to add to that. I absolutely agree with Matt. There's a famous French sociologist / historian, Renan. And Renan has this sort of famous statement about, in order to remember things, you have to forget things. And again, it fits with what Antonio was saying. And I think it also fits across our three presentations. And, there's a wonderful example of that, or a wonderful and important example of that, is when you invent nation states, the nation state needs you to forget that you have local identities, that you have gender identities, that you have other things that make you different from your fellow members in the nation. And so there's a old classic book, and not quite as old as I am, but close to that, by a French historian called Eugene Weber. And Weber had a book called Peasants and the Frenchmen, asking this question: how do you turn late 19th century peasants into people who think, I'm not from Bordeaux, I am French? And one of the things that Eugene Weber argued in that book was education does that. So at a certain level, we are all complicit in the process of making people forget some things in order to remember others. But I think that a part of what our department is trying also to do is to remember many of the suppressed histories of the past. And that's part of what decolonizing, the curriculum decolonizing history is all about. It's about finding the forcibly unremembered or the conveniently unremembered bits of national and colonial and imperial histories.
Yeah, this is also an important question in many fields of history. Obviously, Renan comes to mind, but the historian of the Shoah, Joseph Yerushalmi, in Les Usages de l'Oubli, the usages of forgetting, has a famous quote, which is that perhaps the opposite of forgetting is not memory, but it's justice. So from the perspective of historians who try to write the history of groups who have been willingly silenced because of, for example, genocidal or racist agendas, then making us remember the historical experiences of this group is absolutely central to the work of the historian. And it's also something that can make us learn from a past of abuses, give us the voices of the persons who had a different experience of that past, who would have done things differently, and who can inspire us today. So yes, it's a very good question. And we're trying, as Margot said, to unearth some voices that have been forgotten.
Please, I'm coming.
Is it becoming more difficult to find those voices with the amount of misinformation that we have, and the fact that generally it's the victors of the war that write the history?
I don't know what my colleagues think, but I don't think it is becoming more difficult. I think there's always, people always can, there was a selective, there is an instrumental use of memory. There has always been, at the same time, there have always been groups who are fighting to put their experiences on the agenda in one way or another. And maybe the importance of social media today and how easily accessible they are to all social groups is actually making it a bit easier to have more versions of people's experiences of the past. I don't know.
I suppose I would say the digitization of so many historical primary sources, and Matt Center, one of the wonderful things that the LBS Center does is to just put in the public domain all kinds of ways of finding people's stories. I think that element of digital history and digital humanities is emancipatory and will remain so. The difficulty comes with some forms of generative AI, where the question is, yeah, you found it, but I'm going to distort it. And that's a difficult thing. But as historians, we know that's not the first time that's happened, right? So hopefully the sorts of critical skills that we try to impart to our taught students and our research students will help people navigate that morass.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think what's happening with the digital accessibility to lots of sources these days is actually encouraging, because it's opening access to things that people couldn't access before. And from that, new generations, new researchers in different parts of the world are asking different questions of those sources, and we're getting a lot really interesting things from it. But I do take your initial point about misinformation. It relates to the early question, because I do think we run into a great danger in the world we live in today for that to occur. And even more troubling, as you know, speaking as a historian, is the creation of what I call fictionalized histories in mass media, in popular spaces, because as Benedetta said, it's very difficult to consume all this information. Even with the digital records that we have access to as historians, we can't consume all of it. You know, some of my students are in the room and they may have heard this this analogy. A well-known historian of Latin America once told me that when the first photocopier machine was brought into the National Archives in Mexico, he was upset because he says, you know, he couldn't believe it. And everyone was so excited. Here's a photocopying machine, it's going to be labor saving and all of that. And he said, that's going to be the death of historical research. And then I asked why. And he said, because now everybody's going to think they have a copy of the original document. And they're not going to have the same sort of relationship with the document. I thought at the time it was quite an extreme view to hold, but now we're living in an age where people can't process all of that stuff, right? And there's a sort of clamor for simple ways of processing information. And where the detail comes in is in that small little area that I choose to know in detail. I'll know that in detail, but the rest of everything else, I'm quite content with just knowing it on the surface. And that's where a great danger could lie.
Thank you. That's all fascinating perspectives. But one particular remark which really caught my attention, which was to look at the League of Nations for some of the background to modern anti-slavery campaigning. And I have to say, it had never occurred to me that might be somewhere that had a positive, enduring benefit. So I wanted to make a comment about resources and assumptions. And say the assumption always seems to be League of Nations was a complete waste of space. Now I know in one respect it wasn't. But I'll give you one other example of where not to dismiss something because the assumption is it didn't achieve anything. And that's the Congress of Vienna. And the whole movement to restore looted Nazi artworks to their original owners actually derives from the Congress of Vienna and legislation and treaties to make the French return artworks that Napoleon had looted. So there's two examples of places of international movements that are often dismissed, but actually need a much closer look at them and to be treated maybe with more respect. Thank you.
Just briefly, absolutely. I mean, there are lengthy studies of the League of Nations, the travaux préparatoires, the preparatory works, the various committees, who they were formed, and it's definitely worth using the League of Nations as a space which shaped our contemporary perspective on what slavery is. It shaped contemporary anti-slavery law in very important ways. The definition, the legal definition that we use today for slavery in international law, so which is applied, from cases from, Yugoslavia to Australia, was developed in that context. It was developed in a colonial context because the first draft of the slavery definition was by Frederick Lugard, who was one of the leading colonial administrators in this country. But it was constantly adopted, reinterpreted, challenged in all the places where it was applied. And the Congress of Vienna was perhaps one of the first international congresses where world powers took a stance against the slave trade and made one of the first legal commitments to oppose what they called the scourge of humanity. So legal historians have looked at the evolution of anti-slavery across all these spaces. What they have looked very little at, however, are the histories of anti-slavery in an entire continent, which is Africa, that was very closely connected, and that was always an object in these international spaces. At the Congress of Vienna, at the Congress of Berlin, at the, in the League of Nations, and later with the supplementary convention of the League of Nations, it was always talked about, but never considered as one of the main actors in the anti-slavery process and movement, as it has been. So recovering that agency is an important historical challenge.
Thank you. My mind is slightly blown by the thought of Frederick Lugard having been involved in any helpful way in defining slavery. But the question I wanted to ask was really to invite the panel to reflect a bit more on some of what you see as the main drivers in patterns of forgetting. And some of them, I guess, are kind of fairly obvious things, like things we feel collectively guilty or uncomfortable about. We might collectively want to forget, but some of the things that we forget seem so extraordinary. I mean, I'm thinking of the moment when Lawrence Fox, who obviously should not be seen as an authority on anything, said that the film 1917 was woke because it portrayed an Indian soldier as having taken part in the First World War. And you thought, well, everybody who lived in Brighton at the time knew perfectly well. And it's hardly a surprise. People have been writing books about that for a while. And yet, at a very general public level, it was still possible for him to say that. And for lots of people to think, oh, well, he's right about that, isn't he? Because there can't possibly have been any Indian people fighting in the First World War. So, but I'm really sorry about this bit of a ramble, but I'd be really interested in your perspective on the big drivers of patterns of forgetting, if you think there are any, of course.
I'll just offer one very brief one is, I think a strong one is trauma. A lot of people forget because the past is too difficult. And often when that past is heavily sort of defined by violence, and whether personal or historic violence, people choose not to remember that for their own existence. And sometimes as well, they're reflections of that trauma in their everyday life, and they just don't want to confront it. I think that's a huge driver for sure.
So Matt's offered you trauma. I'm going to offer you gender. And I would say that from two perspectives. I study East India Company families, and some of the first people to write the histories of those families are the wives and daughters and nieces of East India Company men. And they write out of those stories particular bits of the history, including almost all of the bastard children. But there's a bigger erasure that happens in the history of the East India Company, which is the erasure of slavery from it. So we all know that it's 1833 in which the British abolish slavery across the British Empire. Nuh-uh, not in India, they don't. And one of the reasons that Indian slavery gets left out of the story, both by Parliament and by people who remember the histories of abolition, is because slavery in British India is predominantly domestic slavery of women and children. So it doesn't count as slavery because it's always mentally being compared to the Caribbean, the Cape, and Mauritius, where plantation slavery rules. So I think gender is also really important.
We had trauma, we had gender. I'm going to mention life cycle, because what I've been fascinated by what the authors of our sources remember at different moments of their life cycle, and how if we had only one source, we would reach very different conclusions as historians if we generalized based on that. A young woman who has just been forcibly kidnapped, she has lost her children, her family, she's never going to see them again, she's forced to marry someone as an enslaved concubine, talks about her life as hell. she has just stopped living a life worth living. She's ready to end her life. She doesn't know what to do, where to go. When she writes a life narrative as an old woman who has given birth to many children to that man she didn't want, and her children were successful and accrued, sort of gave her a certain status, she has a memory that is a memory that she can live with. And it's a positive memory of her life. And she defines herself as, this is an actual case, I was the mother of a large tribe. And the pride that is there is so different from the voice of the enslaved young woman. That is a remarkable thing that reminds us easy generalizations are treacherous to the historian. If we want to understand processes, we have to always bear in mind the detail.
Could I just say one thing, maybe to add the complication that might be maybe useful for the informal? After the last question, then we have to remember that there is a buffet. One thing about oblivion is that we also have to remember that the right to be forgotten is an individual right, as a freedom, as an agency of the individual. Again, so sometimes institutions in a Foucaultian way can also compel memory. So memory can be sometimes as oppressive as oblivion. The right to be forgotten is a statutory right in the UK, in the idea that your data shouldn't be kept indefinitely, that you can ask institutions to actually dispose of data that they have about you. So that is something that complicates our relationship with oblivion and memory. And but last question. Oh.
You can tell from that Antonio has recently completed his annual mandatory data protection.
You remember that?
Thank you for these fascinating interventions. In response, a word that has repeatedly come up from the audience that has attentively listened to you is forgetting. And it sat a little ill with me as forgetting was equated by one person as choosing not to remember. I guess for me, forgetting is a deliberate, or choosing not to remember is a deliberate act, and forgetting is not something you can deliberately do. And so I want to invite the panel to offer us definitions of forgetting and of denying and disavowing, and to comment upon the extent to which the lack of memory that we have seen in various societies, and especially in this colonial society, still colonial society, the extent to which it's better or more accurately, more appropriately described as not as forgetting, but as denying or as disavowing.
Thank you.
I wonder if we need to add in a way, as historians, an additional term, which I'm not sure is present in your triptych, which is an important triptych, and that's destroying. Because as historians, in order to even get at the question of, is this denial, is this forgetting, what form is this taking, we have to have something in terms of a primary source to grapple with. And so much is destroyed selectively that it's sometimes difficult to work out the provenance and process of erasure that we're talking about. And I would go back in a way to gender, whose letters are preserved, whose letters are not. Overwhelmingly, men versus women tends to be the answer there. Overwhelmingly, whose manuscript memoirs are preserved, is the enslaved person's memoir when it exists, and it exists, as Benedetta's work demonstrates, more often than we thought, preserved as much as the slave owner's memoirs. So I think I would add destruction or destroy to your group of terms that we need to grapple with in terms of addressing your question.
Briefly, I mean, one could go on. I've provided one definition by Joseph Yerushalmi, who argued that the opposite of forgetting is not memory, it is justice. And as a historian of the Shoah, he argued that in order to avoid injustice, one should inscribe the memory, one should strive to make that history available so that it will be remembered. That is a particular agenda. It's not an agenda that all history and all historians have to constantly pursue. As Margot said, but as I find in my work, what is also really important to me is interpreting, it's the exegesis of the source. And if the source doesn't say certain things, I want to be very careful not to make it say them. So there is that would be an act of hubris, the wanting, because somehow it fits my political sense, wanting to inscribe something that matters to me in a past that didn't use a certain word, didn't say something. So on the one hand, we need to recover silences, but only when the voices are there, as far as I am concerned. And so this careful analysis and exegesis of a text is also one where if something was forgotten, I just have to accept that I may not know much about it, rather than insert it, for example. So caution, I would say.
Thanks, Nathaniel, for the question. I would just add one element to what's been said, and it's the element of power and the way that weighs in on memory. And I'll just speak to one aspect of that, in which what is seen as valuable memories or memories worth repeating, sharing, ensuring that they live on beyond you, often is heavily, a result of how that memory functions in a system where you may have power or don't have power, so that becomes not important. In fact, for some people, it may be seen as a negative to have that, to hold on to that memory. It's an identification of your powerlessness to have that memory. And I think that you see that playing out quite a lot in Caribbean history, I found. And that need to sort of, it comes back to something Benedetta mentioned, that need to construct a narrative based on a memory that you believe is important to pass on, and the other aspects, the other chapters in that narrative or in that history, you silence and you keep quiet. And maybe, it feels very heavy at the moment with a lot of what we've been saying, and maybe I'll end on something a bit more light, but I think hits at this point. There's a wonderful short story that the Haitian novelist Edwidge Danticat has, and it's a story of a mother who's in exile in New York, cooking in the kitchen, and her young daughter asks her what life was like for her when she was young. And the story has a dual narrative. There's the memory the mother has, which she cannot give to her daughter, because in this new place and at this new time, she doesn't want her daughter to carry what she's carried. And then this false story of that memory that she's relaying to the daughter is absolutely powerful and gripping. And I think that gets at that thing about, how power weighs in on how we remember and what I use the word, choose to forget.
Thank you very much. On that note, I would like to thank again Chloe for organizing the event. I would like to thank Margot, Matt, and Benedetta for the wonderful presentation. But most of all, I want to thank you for being here with us, for taking the time to come and visit us. And apart from gratitude and affection, in exchange for that, there is a nice buffet and drinks and luxurious food, and we can have a chat and continue to remember each other in front of